Gen X doesn't fully trust anyone. Not their government, not their employers, not their therapists, their banks, their doctors, or their politicians. And this is the part nobody says out loud, not even the people they love most. They trust them mostly. They love them completely. But that final 10%, that last quiet reserve that never fully opens, it stays locked. Always. They can't fully explain it, and most of them have stopped trying. It's just the way they are. It's been the way they are for so long that it feels less like a wound and more like a personality trait. But here's the thing about personality traits that feel permanent. Almost none of them actually are. Almost all of them have a specific origin, a precise moment or a series of moments where the world taught you something and you believed it because you had no reason not to. This is the story of how an entire generation learned, before they were old enough to vote, that the world was not a place that kept its promises, and how that lesson never quite left them alone. To understand what Gen X became, you have to understand what they inherited. Not money or property, a mood, a specific ambient atmosphere of institutional collapse that surrounded their entire childhood like weather. Gen X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, grew up watching the adults around them discover in real time that the systems they had believed in were either broken or had been lying all along. Watergate happened when the oldest Gen Xers were children. A president, caught, lying, resigned in disgrace, and then nothing. Life went on. The news moved to the next thing. And children who had grown up being told that authority figures were trustworthy, that presidents and principals and fathers and priests operated from a place of integrity, quietly filed that away. Not as a crisis. Children don't process these things as crises. They process them as information, as an update to their model of how the world works. And the update read, the people in charge are not necessarily who they say they are. Which would have been unsettling enough on its own. But it didn't stop there. Every generation gets a lesson. Gen X got theirs early, repeatedly, and from every direction at once. The 1970s delivered economic stagflation, a word that essentially means the economy being broken in two different ways simultaneously, which economists had previously thought was impossible. Factories closed. Unemployment climbed. Fathers who had worked the same job for 20 years came home early and didn't go back, and the children watched. In the 1980s, the AIDS crisis arrived, and the government's response was, to put it gently, catastrophically slow. Communities were devastated, while official institutions debated whether the crisis was worth addressing. The Challenger exploded on live television in 1986, watched by an entire generation of children who had been told that NASA represented the pinnacle of human achievement and competence. And then the Cold War, the defining geopolitical anxiety of their entire childhood, the thing that put nuclear drills in their schools and the quiet possibility of annihilation in their bedrooms at night, ended. Just ended, almost overnight. The enemy that had structured the world they'd grown up in turned out to have been hollowed out for years. Everything they'd been told to fear, everything the institutions had organized their childhood around, dissolved like it had never existed, which was, in its own way, more destabilizing than if it had stayed. But here's what makes this specifically a Gen X story, rather than just a history lesson. All of that happened while Gen X was largely unsupervised. The latchkey generation, home alone, working it out, which meant they weren't processing these events alongside attentive adults who could contextualize them, soften them, explain what was happening and why it would be okay. They were processing them the way children process things when left to their own devices, absorbing the information directly, without a filter, and drawing the most logical available conclusion. And the most logical available conclusion, when institution after institution fails in front of you during your formative years, is not complicated. Don't assume anything is as solid as it looks. Don't put all of yourself into any one thing. Keep some part of you back, just in case. This wasn't cynicism in the adult sense. It wasn't bitterness or contempt. It was something much simpler and much more psychologically fundamental. It was a child's nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are designed to do. Learning from experience, updating its predictions, protecting the organism from repeated exposure to the same kind of hurt. The problem is that the lesson generalized. It was supposed to apply to governments and institutions. Instead, it applied to everything. To bosses, to friends, to partners, to the fundamental question of whether any person or system could be trusted with the parts of you that couldn't afford to be wrong. Think about what this looks like in a person's actual life. You meet a Gen X adult, and they are, on the surface, some of the most self-sufficient, competent, low-maintenance people you will ever encounter. They handle things. They don't complain. They find a way. They are almost aggressively unbothered by circumstances that would send other people into a spiral. And for a while, especially at the beginning of a relationship, this reads as strength, as capability, as someone who has it together in a way that is genuinely attractive. But spend enough time with a Gen X person, and you start to notice the edges of something else. A resistance to full disclosure, a reluctance to lean, a tendency at the exact moment when vulnerability would actually serve the relationship to redirect toward practical problem solving instead, to fix the situation rather than feel it, to show you they're fine rather than show you they're not. And this isn't performance. It's not a wall they built consciously or a strategy they chose. It's the natural adult expression of a nervous system that learned in childhood that depending fully on something outside yourself is a risk that doesn't always pay off. The institutions failed. The family structures fractured. Divorce rates among boomer parents were the highest in recorded history, which meant that for millions of Gen X children, the most fundamental unit of stability they'd ever known turned out not to be permanent either. So the body learned not to close off entirely. Gen X forms deep bonds, loves fiercely, shows up for the people they care about in ways that are quietly extraordinary. But to hold something back, to keep a private reserve, to never be so fully in that a collapse would take everything with it. It isn't that they can't trust. It's that they trust with the awareness that trust has historically. And then there's what this looks like at work, which is honestly a little darkly funny. Gen X entered the workforce in the late 1980s and 1990s with all the skepticism they developed in childhood and walked directly into an era of corporate downsizing, outsourcing, and the quiet death of the loyalty-based employment contract that their parents' generation had been promised. Companies that had employed the same people for 30 years began laying off thousands at a time, not because those people had failed, but because a spreadsheet somewhere suggested the stock price would benefit. The concept of the company man, the employee who gave everything to an organization and received a career in return, died in front of Gen X while they were still in their early professional years. And they watched it happen with a specific kind of unsurprised recognition. Of course it did, something in them said. Of course, the institution that promised loyalty turned out not to mean it. This is what institutions do. This is what we already knew. Which is why Gen X workers tend to be highly competent and deeply unromantic about their employers. They do excellent work, they meet their obligations, but they do not merge their identity with the company. They do not believe the mission statement more than the quarterly results. They understand, at a cellular level, that the organization is not their friend. And they do not hold this against anyone, because they have never been naive enough to expect otherwise. This reads to boomer managers as a lack of commitment, to millennial colleagues as refreshing pragmatism. To Gen X themselves, it simply reads as accurate. Here's the part that doesn't usually get said. The Gen X trust reserve, that final 10% that never fully releases, is genuinely protective. It is not a malfunction. It is not damage expressing itself as personality. It is a finely calibrated psychological instrument that was built in response to a world that genuinely warranted it, and that has continued to function in a world that has continued to warrant it. The institutions have continued to fail in spectacular and mundane ways. The employers have continued to prioritize shareholders over people. The governments have continued to operate at a distance from the populations they claim to serve. Gen X wasn't wrong. They just learned the lesson earlier and more completely than most. But there is a cost. And the cost is paid not by the institutions, not by the employers, not by the political systems. It is paid in the private spaces. In the relationship where the partner has earned full trust and can't quite get there. In the friendship that is deep and real and still has a wall somewhere inside it. In the quiet loneliness of being someone who has been self-sufficient for so long that even the people who love you most don't always know how to reach the part that actually needs something. Most Gen X people will tell you they're fine with this. And many of them genuinely are. They built a life around the architecture of their own independence, and it has served them well. But occasionally, not often, because Gen X is not a generation that dwells, but occasionally, in the quiet, they might wonder what it would feel like to hand something over completely. To let someone else hold a piece of the weight without keeping one eye on the exit. To trust not because the evidence is airtight, but just because the person is there and the moment exists. And maybe this once, it would be okay. That final 10%, that quiet reserve that stays locked, even in the people Gen X loves most. Now you know where it came from. Not from a decision, not from a wound exactly, from an education. Thorough, repeated, delivered by every institution a childhood is supposed to be able to lean on, one after another, across the entire span of their formative years. They learned what they were taught. They adapted with extraordinary intelligence and flexibility to a world that kept changing the rules. And they emerged as people who are, by almost any measure, among the most capable and clear-eyed of any generation alive. What they paid for that clarity was a small but permanent piece of their ability to rest completely inside a relationship, a system, a moment, without some part of them staying watchful. That's not nothing, but it's also not the whole story. Because the same generation that learned not to trust completely also learned with equal thoroughness how to stay, how to show up anyway, how to love fiercely without requiring certainty, how to build something durable out of materials that were never guaranteed to hold. And maybe that, the ability to commit without full certainty, to stay without full safety is its own kind of trust. Quieter than the other kind, harder won, and possibly, in the long run, more real.